Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's session on the Discursive City. This is the second in our distinguished lectures presented by Chicago Studies, a program of the college, and the Parousia Program for Public Discourse, also a program of the undergraduate college at the University of Chicago. My name is Chris Scrabble, and I'm the Director of Chicago Studies and Experiential Learning in the college. Today's presentation is the second in a series of distinguished lectures, community conversations, and other events that seek to reimagine the future of Chicago after an incredibly difficult in our cities and our nation's history. The series, which we've entitled Chicago Futures, has been developed as a collaboration between Chicago Studies and the Parousia Program for Public Discourse, whose director will offer this evening's lecture. Our goal is to offer a rich and substantive discourse about the future of our city and about the many different communities that make it up. Before I introduce our speaker, I'm pleased to announce that Chicago Studies will be collaborating with Parousia and a number of other academic units to offer a series of immersive course bundles in the spring term. Our Chicago Studies quarters will offer students deep interdisciplinary explorations of distinct aspects of life in our world-class city. The practice of its democracy and politics with an instructor team that includes Dr. Brammer. Its world-renowned theater community as it reimagines itself in response to the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. Its identity as water's metropolis, a city that exists because of its proximity to vital waterways and that has vital responsibilities as the world faces climate change and a forthcoming water crisis. And of course, the opportunity posed by Chicago's many historic buildings as we begin to reimagine and even rebuild them to confront the challenges of sustainability. Information about and applications for all of these rich curricular experiences are available on our website. And now it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Dr. Leila Brammer, the director of the Parousia Program for Public Discourse at the University of Chicago. Rooted in the Chicago principles of freedom of expression, the Parousia Program curricula, programming, and outreach seek to foster capacity for vigorous, inclusive, and productive discourse in the classroom, on campus, and in civic life. Building on the history and theory of freedom of expression and rhetoric, the curriculum and programming advance and practice robust academic and civic dialogue, deliberation, and advocacy. In her own work in public deliberation and dialogue, Leila builds and facilitates frameworks in which community members can come together to understand problems from multiple perspectives and collaborate to develop evidence-based approaches that address challenging community and civic issues. Leila has a background in faculty development and has received numerous institutional, regional, and national teaching awards. We are so grateful to have her with us this evening to reflect on Chicago's future as a more discursive city. And with that, I'll hand things over to Dr. Brammer. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for having me in to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. I have spent most of my career thinking about these issues of public discourse, how to create a robust and inclusive and productive public sphere. And it seems like every day when I get up, that urgency of the work is even more apparent. Certainly the last few years and the last few weeks have brought to bear, I think, for everyone, a clear idea about the central relationship between discourse and democracy. And yet, and I should note here that traditionally the study, theory, and practice of discourse is inextricably linked to civic life. It's just part and parcel of civic life from ancient Athens to today. But the question is, how do we do that? And for me, as somebody who studies discourse, I really want to think about the practices that we can embed in communities that get at that, but also make communities much more resilient and much more part of daily democratic life. So when I think about this, and I do have to mention this up front, the place that we are as a nation, because Chicago and all the communities in the country are in a relief against that. The problem is when we've diagnosed, I think as a public, diagnosed the problem with discourse, we've usually gone to thinking about it as a political divide or determining that it's about a civility issue. I actually don't like the word civility because it's often been used to keep people out of the public sphere, so particularly people that people didn't want into the public sphere. So it is an idea about if we just acted different or if we didn't have this political divide, the discourse would be fine. For me, there's much more going on, that actually the mode and method of discourse that we use as our default is indeed what has left us and led us to the place that we are. Certainly there are people that see the question much more about how do we think about how do we enact controls or manage the discourse that we have? Certainly we can see that in regulation of the social media. We can see that in calls for better discourse. The Biden inaugural could be seen probably maybe even primarily as a call for better discourse, you know, to end the uncivil war, to turn down the temperature, to hear him out, the disagreement without disunion, and of course always the call for our better angels. This idea if we just acted better, then we could have a better discourse. Again, I'm going to locate that problem somewhere else in the type of discourse we're engaging in, and it will always lead to that end. Well, I shouldn't say always. It will lead to the end we are. It's not surprising that we are where we are because of it. Chicago is a case in point that actually demonstrates why thinking about discourse and the problem with it is the political divide, because in that mode, Chicago should be okay, right? Over 80% of Chicago voters voted for Biden. Based on a national conversation that political divide is our problem, then Chicago should be a city where the concerns of the divide and discourse are minimal and government functions well. Clearly that is not his case. The partisan divide that we're facing is a symptom of the discourse, not the thing that has caused the problem. So I really want to get at discursive theory and stop talking back here about it, but get at the practices that would support perhaps a different form of discourse for us. So rather than the question about how to manage the discourse we have, the question I have, how do we create a new form of discourse to allow for robust, inclusive, and productive community involvement? That project for me is really important, and I think Chicago provides an interesting lens into this. I have about, usually this is true of me, I have about 13 different ways I could go with this. And I decided that one way to do it is to follow and pull on a thread of Chicago history that gets at trying to name and trying to determine and trying to institute a new type of public discourse, and then pull that through to today and think about what are the opportunities in 2021 and beyond for us to rethink and have that same sort of conversation. And so tonight I'm going to start in Chicago in the 1890s, where this idea about public discourse and what the public sphere might look like, two big thinkers, not just of Chicago, but big thinkers in the nation, are putting an oar in that stream and thinking about what a different type of discourse might look like for a vastly changing and diverse community. From there, I want to do a little bit, just the tiniest bit of trying to think about what is discourse as a whole, and I can go on a whole rabbit hole on that, so be sure to ask questions, and then use that as a lens to see the problems that we have today and the ways of the discrete practices that we might engage in that show us a way out, and to reform the ways that we do business and politics and discourse. So tonight, my first stop is Chicago in the 1890s. It is an exciting time in Chicago. The University of Chicago is founded in this decade. The city was growing rapidly. In 1880, there are 500,000 people in Chicago. By 1890, that has doubled. By 1900, there are 1.7 million people living in Chicago. Think of that sort of big, rapid growth, and then put it in the lens of where that growth is coming from. In 1890, 3/4 of the Chicago population were new immigrants and their children. That is a remarkable thing about a milieu, and perhaps if the melting pot metaphor worked, of really thinking about what are the diversities, what is a discourse, how could we include everyone? That's certainly not what is taking place necessarily, but there are two thinkers that are trying to think about what that might look like. In 1893, there's the remarkable success of the World's Fair and its imagined futures for Chicago and individuals and the world and the nation. Sorry, I'm looking out over the Museum of Science and Industry. And for many, that was inspiring, but also highlighted the challenges and exclusions of both the current Chicago and the imagined future of Chicago. John Dewey begins his time at the University of Chicago in 1894. And when he comes in the summer of 1894, he's writing to his wife, who's back in Michigan. And he says, "Chicago is the place to make you appreciate every turn, the absolute opportunity which chaos affords. It is sheet matter with no standards at all." He goes on, "It is hell turned loose and not yet hell any longer, but simply material for a new creation." And it is that piece about his idea of a new creation that he brings in his promise when he comes to the University of Chicago. At the same time, we have Jane Addams working at Hull House and welcoming and trying to integrate a diverse community against all odds in an expanding Chicago. I want to highlight just one way each of these thinkers in the mid part of the 1890s was thinking about public, democracy, and discourse. So in 1894, that same summer, is the summer of the Pullman strike. Pullman was very successful. One place you might want to visit, it's unfortunately not as easy a bike ride as it should be because it's only 8 miles away, but Pullman, Illinois. Pullman built an ideal city for his workers on the railroad, one with clean streets, sanitation, parks. He also had moral codes. He didn't want bars or saloons and only certain types of theater. And it also has a panopticon element to it with spies and other things going on. It was a company town that, with best intents, we could think about him creating a sanitized town so his employees could live well. Certainly, we can think about it in other ways that are much more nefarious, particularly with the panopticon type of environment of it. In 1893, there's a great panic a great economic panic across the country. And in that economic downturn, Pullman cut wages for his workers, but didn't cut the rent or the service fees to the people who lived in his town. You can imagine that there might have been already some tensions between an ideal town created for them by someone who was not one of them and had not consulted them. And now you have this particular divide and gap that's just apparent that there's something wrong here for the workers. They strike. They start the strike on May 11th. The strike, because Chicago is a hub, because Chicago provided so many goods and services across the country, and because that railroad strike moved to other communities, becomes a piece of what could be called a national crisis. Certainly for President Cleveland, he sees it as a national crisis and eventually orders government troops that arrive in Chicago on July 4th to break up the strike. As a result, riots ensue and 26 civilians are killed. This particular moment reifies a US, a national and a Chicago relationship with labor. It certainly reifies and extends an idea that labor is ungrateful to the people who provide them jobs. And also, for those who want to go on a deep dive on this, Eugene Debs was the person who one of the leaders of the strike, and when he goes to prison for it, he ends up reading Karl Marx and comes out the other side as an activist in a much broader way. So there's a lot going on in this 1894 that we could spend a lot of time diving into. Jane Addams had attempted to mediate this. She could see this was going to come to no good. And so she wanted to step in with a mediation. She's denied that opportunity. But she ends up crafting a lecture that she starts giving in 1895. It is a fascinating lecture. It's called A Modern Lair. She gives this lecture across the country. It ends up eventually being published in 1912. It takes that long to be published because it's quite controversial for its content and how she calls out George Pullman, although I think for many of you, if you read it, you'll think that she took it a little light on him. I think one of the interesting things for me as somebody who studies rhetoric is she writes it in the form of a literary criticism. And in doing so, you know, it's a way for a woman to enter into public discourse in the mid 1890s, but it also really clearly draws the lines of what is happening, and it allows her to speak to the situation really clearly. In A Modern Lair, modeled after King Lear, obviously, she sets up Pullman as King Lear and even sets him up as a philanthropist. That's what she calls him. And notes that philanthropy without consulting the people who are being served will not work. It will always end in failure. She then goes on further to argue not just that philanthropy needs to consult those it's trying to help, but that there has to be a place in the public sphere for the wage worker. She writes, "We are all practically agreed that the social passion of the age is directed toward the emancipation of the wage worker, that nothing will satisfy the aroused conscience of men short of complete participation of working classes in the spiritual, intellectual, and material inheritance of the human race." It's a really interesting piece. And then she goes on, it's a moral argument about an exclusive and an inclusive and expansive public sphere, not an elite. It's a really interesting piece. There's much more here. I'm going to move on because I could spend a lot of time talking about this piece of rhetoric. It deserves a deep dive at some other time. Note the discursive approach to this and to politics more generally. Not only she called out paternal politics, but she's promoted a new idea of the public, centrally locating the interests and active involvement of people in democracy in the community. So here we have Dewey catching up with this. He lauded her piece, and then he arrives in 1894 at the University of Chicago. I should note, he's deeply concerned about the reaction of professionals and academics to the laborers who were involved in the strikes. He writes again to his wife, the reaction of academics, shows what it is to be a higher class. And I fear Chicago University is a capitalist institution. That is, it too belongs to the higher classes. Note even that we can see an everyday democracy, a democracy for every person, a broad and expansive public sphere is a principle that's underlying much of what he's talking about. His philosophy of democracy not only depended on that involvement of, I think he would be okay with me saying everyone, an active participation of the people, but that it would be lived out in our daily lives, that each of us would live democracy across the fences and at the bus stops. And so he turned his attention to what are the necessary conditions for creating that kind of involved and participatory democracy. And one of the ways that he pursued that, I think one of the main ways he pursued that, is through education. Again, in 1894, in a letter to his wife, "When you think of the thousands and thousands of young ones who are practically ruined negatively, if not positively, in the Chicago schools every year, it is enough to make you go out and howl on the street corners. At the University of Chicago, Dewey was able to seize on an opportunity to experiment with his ideals surrounding democracy, the public, and education. And he did so in the lab school. Most significant when we talk about Dewey and democracy and education is often what gets lost is how central he found communication or discursive practice to both his education system and to democracy. And it's reflected in his first education proposal when he talked about the lab school. He talks about for a child to become an effective member of society, they need training in science, in art, in history, and I'm going to put an and in there for him, and a command of the fundamental methods of inquiry and the fundamental tools of discourse and communication. So in 1896, he starts the lab school. You know, his time there comes to an end. He continues to write about school and society and the importance of democracy and education. And I want to fast forward to 1927, when he writes The Public and Its Problems. It is in that book that he calls out the modes of communication or the modes of discourse and debate as being the largest issue facing the public. It is also in there where he constructs a theory of the public. And it is this idea that the public is a group of people that have a clear consciousness of communal life in all its implications, and they're constituted in the idea of democracy, a sense that they have a problem that brings them together. He then goes on to talk about what the great community, an idealized version, would look like. This great community can only occur with free and full intercommunication. He continues, till the great society is converted into a great community, the public will remain in eclipse. Communication can alone create the great community. And his communication, and there's lots in there because he's responding to Lippmann, so there's a lot about journalism and thinking about that. But he also goes on to think about that notion of community, the neighborhood, the local, the face-to-face cooperation that is necessary for democracy. Again, that idea of the democracy takes place in the conversations we have at the bus stops and across the fences. I also think it's interesting, you know, there's much about, if you can see that Dewey, we could transport him to today, and some of his critiques continue. He also warns of distractions of the modern life. He warns that people are drawn from politics by the movie, by cheap reading matter and the motor car, because it might be more interesting for people to talk about, but that we should return our attention to politics. And then finally, he comes to the idea of that essential need for the improvement in methods of conditions of debate and discussion and persuasion. So for me, when I look at these two thinkers, and there's much more we could do with both of them, we have both of them with a critique of public discourse and how it is performing, as well as politics. And then both of them rethinking an idea about a discourse that is much more diffuse, that is much more ground up, and is certainly much more inclusive and imagines the people as a role and a significant role in democracy. So what does that look like and how they think about it? For both of them, discourse isn't advocacy. I want you to think about that. We often think about public discourse as advocacy. It is one person or a group of people advocating for something. That is not how they have positioned that public sphere of discourse among the people. It might be an end result of it, but there's steps before that. They're talking about an engagement, a face-to-face, a knowing, an understanding of people. Indeed, the public sphere for them is a place of inquiry, a place where people come together to talk about issues, come to an understanding about those issues, maybe come to some proposals about what can be done, and ultimately maybe then move to inquiry. That is an interesting take on discourse. And it's particularly interesting for me because it is a take on discourse that is a classical approach of rhetoric in my field. Yes, rhetoric, the art of persuasion as people see it, but if you read how it is approached by Aristotle and others, rhetoric in that discursive society of Athenian democracy was about understanding an audience. And to understand an audience and an issue, you had to get to know the people who were influenced by that. Now, that was just part of a milieu of Athenian democracy. They were, living in a small place. They were mostly alike. They were engaging with each other on daily life. It's a different piece. I get that. But that's one of the reasons why Aristotle didn't necessarily create a whole theory around that, because it was such a part of Athenian life. But he's very clearly tells us about a process. He says the first thing you have to do before you speak to something is to know it completely and to know the audience completely. He then says that rhetoric is the handmaiden or the counterpart of dialectic, that you need to discover the truth in those interactions. As you are thinking about gathering information, you are testing and teasing and determining the truth. And then, only then, do we get to his rhetoric and that idea of thinking about how do we position that truth for an audience and present that truth for an audience. I want to take from that Aristotelian definition and thought about democracy. And, I'm going to gloss through a lot of history of development of theory in my field to get to a point where we can think about a discourse that follows that type of process. What does it look like for a citizen to engage that, or for a community to engage that four-part process? Well, let's note it's place-based, it's community-based, and it's evidence-based. And it's dependent on, first, understanding from multiple perspectives, of getting to know the people in the community, how they are seeing things, what their stakes are, where they're coming from. The second piece is that dialectic piece. It's then, once we get to know each other, we can test ideas together. We can determine the nature of the situation, the nature of the community, the nature of our relationship. Third, if we think about community advocacy, third, we can move to a process of deliberation. If we have tested out and teased out a nature of a communal problem, then we can think about what can be done. We can weigh alternatives, we can weigh the trade-offs of those alternatives, and we can come to a collective evidence-based decision. And then finally, the fourth part is that advocacy piece. It's only after we know this issue from multiple perspectives, we've tested the ideas, particularly with those who might disagree or have other perspectives, then we can determine, and we've determined how to best address that through best practices and evidence, then we present it. Then we advocate for others. We bring others on board with our ideas, whether those be people who can enact it or others who might be able to, who are sitting on issues or in publics that are adjacent to the issue that we have. From that four-part process of discourse, I think for me, I can see some of the failings or the problems with discourse as we have them in life and our nation, and I would argue also in our personal lives. One, we move to advocacy without doing the work that happens before that, without understanding the problem or the community or the alternatives. And in doing so, we take on a pretty paternalistic, often if we're looking at other communities, a paternalistic and a self-righteous or a tone-deaf way of addressing issues. And as Adam says, it doesn't matter if we have the best intentions in doing it. She would argue we're going to be ineffective because we're not consulting and working with the people in the community. Whether that is us as an institution, whether that is us in a community group, whether that's us as an individual, or whether that's us as a government. Second, this idea that public has to be protected comes from that advocacy mode that leaders know best. And certainly, Chicago has a strong mayor model that has traditionally lent itself and derives from a paternalistic way of doing that. And again, Adams would argue that even the best intention, the benevolent good parent, the wise parent, the chastising parent, but beyond the mayor's office or beyond political leaders. We can see it in institutions and groups and individual activists and community organizations, in education, and in national leaders. This paternalistic tone of "I know best, it'll hear me out, it will be okay." And it's not a consultative form. It's not the ground up that I think is what we're talking about if we're going to have that robust and active and inclusive and participatory public sphere. And then finally, and for me, this is the critical problem that faces us in the type of discourse that we have, is that advocacy leads, and maybe it's not even a result of the advocacy, I'm just going to name it. The way in which we engage political discourse is two-sided competitive debate. And as a mode, that is the root cause of where we are. Debate in that other piece was a subtool, something that we used as part of a process. It was not the process by how we came to best ideas. It was a subtool within a process. Think about two-sided debate and what it does. There are just two sides, usually just one idea, yes or no, right? Then there are winners and losers, and not just the ideas, but the people are winners and losers. And then when we engage in it, it moves to entrench. It doesn't lead us to considering the other side. I don't listen to the other side to understand their argument, to test my ideas. I listen to the other side to see what their weakness and flaw is so I can call it out. And if I do this in this teeter-totter way, I and the others around are moved to the ends of the continuum on this. It leads to polarization. It also leads to echo chambers where we're not testing our ideas. It is John Mill's idea of our empty beliefs. We say them so much and we're too focused on the other side that we're not even testing our own ideas. And then it devolves, always, competitive debate tends to devolve into questions of facts. Who has the right facts? Who owns the facts? And tricks and tools. And it becomes not about the idea, not about the evidence, not about the argument, but almost a cage match that's more about satisfying a fan base that's out there or attacking the other side than it really is about finding out what are the best ideas that we have to move things forward. It also has some real consequences, not just in limiting our ideas, has real consequences in who it leaves out. That access to a competitive debate is available to those with training and with ease engaging in that. I can promise you when I talk to students and others about that, there are so many that are turned off. They do not want to engage in politics because that's not a venue or something that interests them in a discourse. It's also important in what it leaves out, that true testing of ideas and the multiplicity of perspectives. Now we got two, now we've lost people from the public sphere who aren't interested in it and afraid of it, afraid to even discuss politics, and then we're really left with the two camps. Then we end up with an echo chamber. And in that echo chamber, the testing is not even allowed. Try to think about someone, or try yourself, to take a middle position, right? Ask Liz Cheney, ask Steve Mnuchin. What happens when you try to take a middle position and end up in that no person's land in our political divide? Try testing an idea. There's a litmus test, right? You can't test too many ideas and be included in the group. 3, it leads to then entrenchment and polarization. Again, I'm going to diagnose it that that's our problem because that's a form of discourse. That's what we're going to end up in. And at the end of the day, we end up with a sporting match. I've already used the metaphor of cage fight, but it's two opposing teams. There's fans on each side, and it's a brawl. And from it, I argue no winners, certainly not the common good exits the stadium as a winner in this. There's much more here. for me to dig into, but I realize I've already dug a little further than I should have. So what does it look like? Because I know I have probably pushed some buttons among some of you out there. I'm just waiting to engage with all of you, and I want to have this piece on the discursive community and city actually have time for the discourse about it. So, and for me to be challenged and for us to engage in what we're talking about. But what does it look like for us to reconfigure then? To reconfigure discourse, not as debate, not as a two-sided competitive, and let me just note the type of debate, a two-sided competitive debate with winners and losers. What does it look like if we were to configure discourse as not that, but our political discourse as inquiry? An inquiry in which we engage with self and community. What would that look like deployed? So let me turn to some ways in which we might be able to deploy that. I'm going to cover a lot of ground here. And I want to say before I enter in, when I'm talking about this, this is not a decision that I should make, an academic should make, a group of academics should make, a group of anyone should make. It should be decided by the community. Let us use the type of discourse that I'm advocating for, the inquiry-based, for the community to decide the modes and methods that serve and amplify voices and create the inclusiveness. So I want to talk about it in three vectors. One, what could be done from the city, in the city government? So maybe the top down, but hopefully we could bubble up some of these models from the bottom. I want to talk about it in education, and I want to talk about it in our personal lives, because much like Do, I believe it exists in our personal lives. So my first piece would be thinking about what are the community practices that would be embedded in doing this. If you're wondering what it might look like to do that, it looks like much like what Stacey Abrams did. She individually did not go talk to individual Georgians. She didn't even have that as her plan. She created an infrastructure in which she consulted with communities and trained community members to be employed in their communities to provide information and services. Her first venture was to help community members register for the Affordable Care Act. Imagine, if you haven't ever tried to register for the Affordable Care Act, I suggest even opening the webpage. It is a difficult process to navigate. And imagine if you don't have access to internet. Imagine if you're in a state that maybe even has a more difficult mode of navigating that sign up. And then from there, that same group of people, more trained, started delivering information about voting, not just registering voters, but informing them about voting, and then ensuring that their votes would get counted. So not just getting them into polls, but informing them about that whole process. And in that, it's brilliant and it's effective, right? But it's also something that we've known a long time about, that when we go into communities, they're experts about their own problems. We are most trusting and most moved by those who are our neighbors and who are like us. And then the importance and resonance of creating a network of community members there. I think there's just an interesting way in which the network that Stacey Abrams created could be deployed in different ways. Think about what that would do for vaccine distribution, right? It is our friends and neighbors who are going to convince us to take the vaccine, not a public relations campaign. It is on the ground that those types of things take place. Why does a company pay $5.6 million for 30-second commercial during the Super Bowl? It's not for us to watch that 30 seconds. It's for us to continue that conversation with our friends. It's in that beyond where the advertising, and in that personal where that advertising takes place. It becomes embedded in our discourse. We can do the same with politics and with helping others. So there are many community-based practices of discourse and democracy. I can go into details about some of these, but the idea is that they need to be, it's up to the community to adopt those and think about what they are. It is not somebody from the outside. And so we have things that have worked, you know, citizen jury, participatory budgeting, participatory grants, from the call to the actual grant decision to the follow-up of the granting agency, all of that being taken place in the community. We have ideas about participant action research, where community members, and actually I think the best deployment of participatory action research is when it's used with high school students, and they become the researchers of their communities and gathering the wisdom and knowledge and then putting that into reports that they can then advocate to agents of change. It's a really great ground up that's a win-win-win for the community, training students in that, but also those same skills are the skills of academics and professional life. So there's a lot out there that could be deployed in what I would think is a modest proposal. I want to move to education. I want to pick up that piece about Dewey. I think the events, and more people are talking about this. I expect more people will be talking about this in the next year and months. The events of January 6th, particularly, I think brought into relief for many people the idea of the need for more embedded civics education. And yes, students need to know how government works. They need to know the Constitution. But like Dewey, I argue that students need to know discourse. Discourse is the means by when we get things done. By the way, discourse isn't perfect. Somebody asked me about that. There are problems with discourse, but it is all we have. It is the only way that we can use to engage ideas. We need to embed that in curriculum in high school and college campuses. And when we embed it, it needs to be embedded right alongside of thinking and writing. There's a real wisdom of that classical conception of the trivium in the liberal arts, of rhetoric, logic, and grammar. The idea that speaking, thinking, and writing are intricately connected. We cannot do one well without the other, and that these skills extend beyond into every discipline, I would argue, into democracy, into everything that we do as human beings. We prepare students with math for the world, and they need it. We need to prepare students for discourse in the world. In fact, our lives are lives of discourse, civic, academically, professionally, personally. We live lives of discourse. Even the accountant and the mathematician spend their lives in discourse. I cannot stress this enough from me. Discourse needs to be a central piece of education and embedded across, much like writing, much like critical thinking, across the discipline. And there's many ways that we can do that, and many ways that individual schools have either embedded it in a curriculum, or individual schools operate like deliberative communities, like Dewey's idea about education as a deliberative body involving students and faculty in making decisions. But finally, because I want to leave time for the questions, there's also an individual mode here in the discourse. And it's really key to changing it. It really does start at home as far as democracy. It's a key to democracy in daily life, and that it literally takes place at the bus stop and across the fences. It's democracy in the person, not just the people. Danielle Allen, who used to be at the University of Chicago, in Talking with Strangers, talks about that type of discourse as a citizenship, a political friendship. I also appreciate her because she reclaims rhetoric as a way of that is a reflexive practice, that we have to get to know each other, and there are ways within that discursive practice to get to know each other. So what does it look like for us to engage in that type of discourse? First of all, Abrams, that's exactly what she created, was a personal network in which people went out and created personal relationships and became a collective in action. And again, I think there's so much potential about what can be built upon that type of infrastructure. Beyond that, while I'm talking about this, while you're thinking about the ideal and what this might look like, I want to add on some added advantages to this idea of talking with strangers and engaging the people in our community. it helps us and it helps others. There's a wealth of studies out there that show that engaging others help us build community. They help us build mental health, both for the recipient and for us as a person who's engaging others. They help us build resilience. If we have these type of measures, both for wellness, and I would argue for the wellness of our democracy, then it's up to us to engage others when we go into the world, and certainly understand their constraints about this, right? We have concerns about strangers. We have our own insecurities about how do I engage with strangers and what will I talk about? And then we have the multiple distractions that were identified by Dewey. For us, we have the ubiquitous phone, right? And we choose that phone even when we go out and we can talk to real people. And again, all of this has been exacerbated by the pandemic. I think this is a place where we can ask some serious questions about how we re-enter our lives with others after the pandemic. As we start to prepare for that, and it's a little difficult when we're out masked in the world to smile and glance at people. But by the way, these studies, even if people get a smile from someone, it has some change as far as feeling included. As we prepare for our change into the world, and as we're masked, maybe we can develop a practice of waving at each other or nodding at each other or acknowledging others, particularly now in our social isolation. For me, this, not only Danielle Ellen, but I think this was captured best in poetry by two inaugural poets, Maya Angelou in 1993 with her poem On the Pulse of Morning, ends with this idea about this. She writes, "Here on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face, your country, and say simply, very simply, with hope, good morning." Look at the reflection of that same sentiment at the very end of Amanda Gorman's beautiful piece a few weeks ago, The Hill We Climb. She writes, "The new day blooms as we free it, for there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." For me, those are calls for us to move into a discourse of community and inclusiveness that starts with us as individuals, bubbles up through a community, and I hope can change structures. Yeah. It's idealist, does it answer a need? Maybe in a way, but we have nothing to lose from trying this. We know the old way doesn't work. Can we reclaim a democracy that is more inclusive, more rigorous in our testing of ideas, and more productive in bringing out a better life for all of us? So with that, Chris, I end. I am sure that there are questions stacked on this. Let's go.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Brammer, first for your remarks. As a matter of fact, we do have a few questions that have been piling up during the course of our conversation. Let me begin with the earliest that came in. You talked about the importance of the face-to-face for authentic community building. Given that we're in the middle of this period where everyone is so isolated, how do you think that this has exacerbated the present day challenges of discourse that we've all been living with?
You could imagine, based on what I've said, that we've been even further removed from those communities, even further removed from eye contact and smiling at others, and the ways of, now when I'm teaching, I sit here, I see my students, but I don't see them before class. I don't see them after class. I don't walk across campus and see a student or see you, Chris. I think that those isolations are difficult for us as a democracy. They're difficult for us as a community. And I think they're really psychologically difficult for us as individuals. I do think we need to have a discourse about how we return to life post-pandemic. I'm not a psychologist, but I think we're going to have some overstimulation and maybe, but also maybe a way in which we can rethink about how we're going to engage with others when we do that returning. I will say, as much as we don't have the connections that we once had, there are ways, and I can't believe I'm going to say this because there's so many problems with it. I do think there are ways in which Zoom does capture some of those conversations if we can get people in the room for those conversations. The problem is we don't have the before and the after and the in-between that develops the personal relationships. And I've said this to my students, I really miss the whispering in class. I miss those in exchanges. I miss them looking at each other. All of those are a really important part of building a community in a classroom.
From my own experience in the classroom, I have to say that frequently the whispering and the back and forth is actually happening in the chat or the Discord that's behind the class. So if only you had access.
Yeah, I know. It's very clear. They've told me that, Chris, that they have little text message threads. I can only imagine.
Let's see. So a number of people have highlighted one question. Stacey Abrams' work, which you cite so favorably, was in some ways a protest gesture. She activated infrastructure to build community power after she had been cheated out of quote unquote official power by a political structure that embodied a lot of the paternalistic and racist tendencies that you're lamenting. How does a counter institution transition into the institution? So for example, city government, which is where you brought up her example for the first time. Can it? Does something get lost in that transition?
Yeah, I worry about this. I've been trying to think about what that looks like. What an apt question. Thank you for it. I don't know what that looks like in a city government because we have such distrust in government as an institution that I worry about whether such would work. I guess what I was using Stacey Abrams there for, and then I want to talk about in a second way, I was using that work to note that I think there is something captured there in the individual and the personal that could be used as a way for the city and government to raise up individuals and communities and involve them in decision-making processes. And again, that's where I'm thinking about things like participatory budgeting, whether that's a model for Chicago or not. Again, not my decision, not the city, but I think it's a decision we can come to together among the community. I think for me, if I won the lottery, like the really big lottery, I would love to create an organization that would play an experiment in that kind of space of working with an organization or an infrastructure like Stacey Abrams built in Georgia, not just Atlanta, throughout the state. What's it look like to build that organization, to have people who are able to deliver knowledge and resources in local communities and gain and gather those knowledge and resources back out, those kind of conduits in communities. What might that look like as a model? How can we build it out? I do think it is, I think it's an interesting model for democracy. I think there's a benefit there. I think there's a potential. I would love us to explore and think about experimenting with that more.
One of the specific examples that you cited earlier about sort of an interesting potential for a structure like Stacey Abrams was in regard to vaccine distribution. To what extent or how did the American pragmatist idea of discursive politics extend to science or tech, or did they have a science versus value epistemic divide? What does this mean for contemporary efforts to build a discursive city alongside sort of more technocratic fields like urban science and data-driven policy?
So Dewey has a place for experts in his pragmatism, but he really is about that power and the knowledge and the community and a balance in there. I think that's still a tension, right? I just think that's a tension that we need to work out. It's going to be different in every community, but what do you do? And it's for me, when I build a framework for a community, it's a tension for me. I'm coming in from the outside. I'm not usually a member of the community that I'm building for. And I'm building for an organization. I have some values and some principles that I'm acting under and doing that. Boy, for me, that's just always a tension I'm working through. I think the same is true for, and regret not having said this from the beginning. I think we have to solve and have some, not solve, we need some better ways of discourse, because every one of our challenges is going to require a discursive solution, a process in which we engage in discourse, in which academics who are bringing the science to bear are in discourse with communities who have other forms of knowledge that they're bringing to bear. And how do we have a discourse in which we bring those together, tease out differences, and come up with the creative solution? When we have that flattening of the teeter-totter, as I talk about, our best ideas come in tension when we're engaging people that we disagree with. And Chris is testing me and I'm like, I'm not sure, but no, okay, what about? And we find a third path or a fourth path or a fifth path forward. The creativity comes in the tensions of us teasing that out. I would like us to have more of that place-based community piece in which experts are embedded and drawing on and contributing to community knowledge, and then us bringing our best thinking to how we resolve those issues together. I don't know if that answers the question, but I do have a note about vaccine distribution. If it is, and we're seeing some failures in it, right? If it's going to be a top down from the hospital to the individual, there are going to be some resistance there. It's also a very difficult delivery. What does it look like if we involve the community organizations and the people on the ground who have the connections with people? What if we put the vaccine clinic in a church, right? A local church that has a lot of members. What if that's where the vaccine clinic is? What if and then those people go out and they talk to their friends and they talk to their neighbors. That's the type of persuasion well, actually, I don't think Coke's buying a Super Bowl commercial, but that's the type of persuasion that somebody's buying with the Super Bowl commercial. They're buying us talking about it the next day with our neighbors and our friends. What if we buy that and distribute it into the community in that way? I think there's a potential and a possibility for much more adherence and many more vaccines just delivered to communities that most need them.
We've talked a little bit about the role of experts as one power community. You've identified a few others that in some ways may be closer to the ground, although I think a look at the history of Woodlawn, for example, would show that even the big churches aren't always on the side of all the residents in their communities, right? We have another question that asks about the role of unions. Early in the lecture, talking about the Pullman strike, you mentioned the role of unions in their early rebellion against government and corporate paternalism. What do you envision the role of unions to be in the establishment of maybe a more ideal discursive city today?
I love that question. I really, for me, I love unions because they are that community-based interest that's coming together, a public that comes together around shared interests and shared concerns, and do it in a way that they're able to advocate and create a power for them as laborers and as workers. I think that that's not that different from the type of piece that, I'm using a model of Stacey Abrams, but that type of piece is a collective that's already brought together by a shared interest. I just think there is a model again in the labor union in doing that. From the past, obviously they're maybe not as strong as they once were. I'm always going to be on the side of communities getting together, finding their concerns, and then being able to advocate to their concerns to the people who would be agents of change. And for union, those agents of change are their employers or industry or corporation.
We have another kind of targeted question, and then a few kind of bigger picture questions that we might step back and look at. First, though, Sarah asks, what role might this reimagined discourse play in the struggle around policing today? A conversation that you and I were both involved in just a little bit earlier this afternoon. Do any community-oriented policing programs effectively, those which seek to create engagement between officers and community members, capture the inclusive and democratic aims of a reimagined discourse of the sort you're speaking of? What happens when there are at least nominal attempts to reimagine discourse in policymaking, but there isn't a cultural buy-in from the implementing arms of the group providing the space for discourse, in this case, individual officers or even police departments?
Sarah, what an apt question. I really appreciate it. I do think this is one of the issues that is complex and is going to require a discursive solution to that. I think one of the problems is you know, the idea of community policing sounds great, but it is like Virginia Woolf said about the word feminist. It probably needs to be burned to the ground because it doesn't mean what it was supposed to mean. I'm not saying I agree with Virginia Woolf, I'm just quoting her. But I think that the piece about community policing, the principle of it is okay. The language, as a rhetorician, I'm going to say the language needs to be changed because it hasn't imagined that. You know, Sarah, this is not an area of which I have an expertise on, but in reading, I have come across a few examples of individual police and in localized community police where this has functioned better than some of the other places that we see it. I honestly believe that in order, and again, not my area of expertise, so I'm going to put an or in still. I believe in that to have a police force means that it must be community centered. I, up to a few years ago, lived in Minneapolis, and I don't know what the stats are anymore, but it was the vast majority of police officers didn't live in Minneapolis. That to me is deeply concerning. To serve means to serve a community of which you are a part. And so the more that we can embed those types of services and the people who are policing, the firefighters, the labor union organizers, the teachers, the principals, the politicians living in neighborhoods, that will be, for me, a development of a much more eclectic, inclusive, and vigorous public sphere. So yes, I would hope that those who are working on that issue are working from that vision.
I'd say this leads us very well to a question from Peter, because he's interrogating some of the same terms that you just used in your last answer. Mm-hmm. Do we even have a stable concept of community or neighbor that we can readily engage anymore? As we think about the destabilization of community, certainly during COVID-19 and with our sort of increasingly online lives, but also as we think about this kind of nostalgic language that America has lost its communities or hearkening back, it seems like a lot of people these days are inclined to say that people who disagree with them in this kind of two-party way are not even part of the community, or they are able to completely avoid engaging with them.
Yes, Peter, and hi, Peter. Thanks for the question. You're absolutely right. I though truly believe in the community. Peter might know that. For others, the metaphor I use, and don't push me too far on this metaphor, but I mean do, and then it'll break down. But you know, we have a table, and I think of the community as a table. And if Uncle Jim is at the table and he throws his plate up and storms out, Uncle Jim is part of our family, and we've got to figure out a way to have the personal conversation to bring him back into the table. Is there something so egregious that Uncle Jim could do that perhaps he's not part of the family? Sure. But we're talking about people who politically disagree with us. I'm not talking about white supremacists. I'm talking about someone who might say, you know, I'm not a fan of Nancy Pelosi. I think that Kevin McCarthy maybe is a little bit too far out there, but you know, that's where I'm going to vote. That person, it's sad that we've lost our ability to have discourse with across that, right? The Pelosi supporter and the Kevin McCarthy supporter, to have a discourse where they can come together and talk about issues. You know, I certainly have some doubts about whether Kevin McCarthy and Nancy Pelosi can come together and have discourse, right? I think the losing of that type of discourse creates some significant problems in how we're doing business. I haven't had the chance today to hear more about what happened in the Republican caucus. That's a place where we can definitely see a disagreement and a breakdown of discourse, actually kind of a three-sided faction, and how that will be brought together. And then how would we ever include the Democrats, who have their own kind of fissure going on? Yeah, it's all kind of messy, Peter. I agree with you on that. I believe in the sense that if we can get past the type of two-sided debate and really get back to looking at the common good and not playing to the public or playing to our fans or playing to the cameras, we can get back to a discourse that we can do things. I will be honest. Oh my gosh, I saw things flashing, Chris. I will be honest. I don't deal with the national. I deal with the local, because I have seen it happen in the local, in the communities where we rub shoulders. There we have a community. When I'm walking from Hyde Park to campus, when there's not a pandemic, I know people. Actually, in the pandemic, when I go on my daily walk, I know the people behind the mask. I will never be able to recognize them without a mask, but we wave at each other. We have a community that we've formed. It's that kind of local community where I know we can make those changes and make the difference.
Well, then, two questions that really follow well. One of these comes from Robert. Robert says, I find it particularly dangerous that the echo chambers you mentioned create alternative facts, which I would personally define as information, often falsely or dishonestly presented, curated by those with power in order to maintain their power. Is it necessary to combat and restructure these systems of power before we can create an inquiry-based system of discourse, or are these things that can be done at the same time? And then how can discourse be fair to a community when capitalist systems make it difficult to know what is a fact or the general process of gathering information?
Robert, you asked the billion-dollar, trillion-dollar question that's in front of us. If you study social media and particularly algorithms, so I identified a problem with discourse that I see this two-sided competitive debate. It was already a problem. It had broken down before we even had cable news. And then when we got to cable news, obviously we had that split. And then we got on social media, we got driven really hard by the algorithms into our polarized echo chambers, in which it becomes really easy to demonize people because we don't even see them as real people. I started in 1997. I started teaching a course in computer-mediated communication, which by then was like a little chat room, right? where people got together and they talked on their computers with green screens. And even then, when my students and I were studying it and reading the new emerging research on it, we knew that when we moved behind screens and we stopped seeing people, that it became easier for us to say the most hateful and horrible things about others. Now we've even further, and now we see the divide that has happened here. I'm not sure what the way back is from that in social media. I'm deeply, deeply concerned by the social media managing our public sphere. That too. So how do we get back from disinformation? Who would regulate it? Who would regulate facts? Is there a fact police? Now we have social media companies stepping in and doing that, and they have a financial interest. I think it's a pretty messy piece. And I know I've gone down a social media route with your question, but I think it is a question for us, and particularly for you and your generation. You're going to be up against it. We have got to figure out what it is that we will do to move out of those places and back into a society where we're seeing people face to face. In that place, I can start testing some facts. I can start testing my experiences. I can think about what is happening there. And so, Robert, I don't know if your questioning is that maybe the Pandora's box has been opened and we've gone too far. I'm not sure. For me, again, I focus on the local discourse. And so when we get to the locality of it, and I'm hoping eventually social media, I know it lives there now, I'm not naive, but the local of the discourse of how we can climb it in communities face to face, I really am with Dewey on the face-to-face nature of communication. And then I will get to that disparity argument. I think if we can move to that and reclaim spaces in which we're doing discourse face-to-face among neighbors, among community members, creating publics where we're seeing common issues that we experience together, coming up with the research and our knowledge and our wisdom and presenting those and moving them forward from the ground up. I think there's a potential for a politics there that changes how things are done. I understand the obstacles in doing so. I understand the obstacles of who makes that happen. I also understand the obstacles of whether they will be listened to. I understand all of that at play. I'm throwing out some ideas that I see as a way in which discourse can help shape communities again and can help create a public discourse that is more inclusive. And maybe an answer, I'm going to go on a really long tangent. Oh, do we have to go, Chris?
You got time. No, you're
okay. I just want to note that public discourse has some problems. It is the discourse itself. Discourse is an imperfect tool. It's language, right? So even if we all spoke the same language, we might come from different linguistic communities even, right? So it's language used by imperfect beings. You know, it's, I don't know, 5:20 on Wednesday afternoon. How perfect am I now? Maybe something happened earlier, right? And I'm cranky or crabby in dealing with that. And so that's imperfect tool by imperfect people. And it requires us then, I believe, to be generous with others and ourselves, and also a humility in how we engage people because of that. And so I just want you to know that discourse has its own hangups and problems and power structures. One more thing, the public sphere is absolutely not level, right? Everybody has different levels of access. I pointed out one of those levels of access, and that was having a skill, an ability to speak into the public sphere and be comfortable speaking with the two-sided competitive debate. Other people have different pieces that make access difficult. And so part of my value when I think about public discourse is that we need to understand that, and then we need to create discursive structures that create a more level public sphere. I hope a level, but a more level, like a more perfect union, right? A more level public sphere that invites and elevates and brings more people to that table so we have more perspectives. The more perspectives we have, the better thinking we will have, and the more buy-in, and the better able to actually move things forward.
I think that sets up one of our remaining questions really well. It occurs to me as I'm listening to you speak that even as we think about the face-to-face, there are so many barriers that we have constructed as a society. I can, in many neighborhoods of Chicago, take a walk and only see other faces that resemble mine along a few different axes of identity. And I really have to go quite a ways out of my normal walking zone to find people who look too different from me, at least in certain neighborhoods of the city. But one of the places where, at least theoretically, we do find ourselves in a bit more of a melting pot is in the context of institutionalized structured education. You mentioned integrating civic discourse into high school education, which of course is largely controlled by the states. What do you think a civics education looks like in high schools, and how do you propose acquiring agreement on what it should look like across those many different districts that would need to come to some kind of agreement in order to implement something like a universal preparation for civic discourse?
Thanks, Andrew, for the question. Illinois, let's just locate in the state. The state has a civics requirement, right? And it's one that teachers struggle at some points to try to implement. I would argue that should be an expanded, civic education, not just about the Constitution, not just about the government, not just about civic issues, but actually the type of discourse and practicing the type of discourse that we need to employ in doing our best work. If students can have that practice, if they can see a different model than turning on choose your poison of a cable channel, right? And seeing people yell at each other. If they can see that, wow, we can engage a discourse in ways that are modulated, in ways that we can test ideas and still respect each other, we can disagree, and we can actually, among that disagreement, come to some common agreements about what we're doing. This is the type of work that I really love doing with students. And whenever I do that, I sometimes used to do this with community members, but when you do it with students, it's amazing. They're almost always like, I didn't know you could talk about issues this way. Because even in an education system, we've adopted that two-sided debate, right? And it's like, okay, this pro-con, right? Not, hey, here's a principle. What are 3 or 4, 5 different ways in which we might approach it, and tease out and think about the trade-offs and drawbacks of each of that, and really engage us in a creative endeavor where voices that weren't on the two sides have another place they can go with. When I talk about discourse and reclaiming discourse in high schools, I sometimes will have them play out a drama where one, like who likes cats, who likes dogs? And then you choose somebody who likes cats, you choose somebody who likes dogs. That discourse disintegrates in about 2 minutes, and everybody's bored because they know where it's going. It's not interesting. The facts are being thrown about. There's all sorts of tools and tricks of argument. And then I always ask who's left out. And there's somebody who likes snakes, there's somebody who likes hamsters, there's somebody who doesn't like pets at all. What's it look like for us to not ask cats and dogs, but ask what is the best type of pet? And let us tease out that system. What's the best way that we might approach this? And I'm just using that as a metaphor for the situation. So that's for me what a civics education would look like, is one that allows for and contains multiple perspectives and allows students to question principles, again, from multiple perspectives, not just either or on that. And Chris, is that taking us to time? Because I want to share an anecdote, since I've gone so anecdotal.
You absolutely should share an anecdote. I've
got
one more question
I understand this is anecdotal. So this was during the House impeachment hearing, and I put an earbud in and did my walk, and I came across a guy who was cleaning his windshield, and he looked at me and he goes, "Hey, how are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm listening to the impeachment hearing." He goes, "Oh, I have that going in my car. I'm so glad I've missed it." He goes, and then he turned to me and said, "We're going to get through this." And I'm like, "We are?" I threw it back at him. He goes, "You know why we're going to get through this?" And he looked at me and he said, "We're going to get through this because I love you." And I was like, okay, that's the type of discourse. And then we sat and chatted some more about his interests and what he was doing and what his work was. That's the type of discourse that can transform, at least a transform for he and I. We made a connection that day, right? I think then we live it into more connections. And so, it is sort of a pay it forward. I understand it has some pieces, but it is so tied to the wellness of us individually, the wellness of our community, and the wellness of our democracy. And it costs nothing for us to practice it. So I encourage you to go out and make somebody's day and your own day.
You certainly have contributed to making ours. Thank you so much, Dr. Brammer, for your remarks and for your thoughtfulness and for imagining a more discursive future for our city with us this evening. Thanks to everyone who has been able to join us tonight. On behalf of the college, the University of Chicago, Chicago Studies, and the Parcia Program for Public Discourse, we're so grateful to everyone who participated in this evening's presentation. If you want to learn more about Dr. Brammer and her work, not only will supplemental material appear along with the recording of this evening's session on the Chicago Studies website later this week, Dr. Brammer is also teaching in one of our forthcoming Chicago Studies quarters, aptly enough in a quarter on Chicago politics that will explore policy making, but also do some hands-on creation of things like curriculum for high schoolers. Check that out again on the Chicago Studies website /quarters. As a reminder, this lecture was only part of a series of events. Our next event will be a conversation with Chicago theater practitioners on the future of Chicago theater. That will happen next Friday on the 12th at 12:30 p.m. over Zoom. Immediately after, we will have an open house conversation about our forthcoming Chicago Studies quarters. Please join us for that as well at 1:30 p.m. Our next distinguished lecture, which is going to be 2 weeks from tonight, will be presented by Dr. Sabina Scheck, who's the director of the program on the global environment and also the faculty director for Chicago Studies. That's entitled The Blue City, and will feature not only Dr. Scheck, but also a panel including journalists, activists, scholars, and folks who are very deeply involved in attempting to think about Chicago's future as the steward of fresh water, a future that is imperiled, of course, by climate change. We look forward to you joining us then and for many other Chicago Studies events. Thank you all and have a wonderful night. Bye-bye.